The German shepherd's eyes had gone somewhere else entirely. Not to the crowd of 200 people pressing against the safety barriers at Raven Ridge Medical Center's lawn, not to the 6 handlers closing in with catch poles, not even to the man holding the tranquilizer gun with his hands shaking so badly the barrel wobbled. Sergeant, that was his call name, 8 years of combat deployment, 3 Purple Hearts worth of missions his handlers liked to brag about, had gone back to somewhere hot and loud and burning. His lips pulled back. A sound came out of him that made people grab their children and step away from the barriers. The military veterinarian had already made the call. 30 seconds. If they couldn't contain him in 30 seconds, they were putting him down right there on the grass in front of the veterans he had once protected. And in the back of the crowd, pressed against a chain-link fence in faded scrubs and a pair of sneakers with a split seam, a 31-year-old nurse named Emily Carter watched the handlers move in and said quietly to no one in particular, "You're reading him wrong." The woman next to her laughed. "If you've made it this far, stay with me. Subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." Now, let's go back to the beginning. Cedar Falls was not the kind of city that drew attention to itself. It sat in the flatlands of the Midwest with the stubborn permanence of something that had survived floods and factory closures and the particular kind of economic grief that came from watching an industry leave and never return. Raven Ridge Medical Center was the largest employer left. It occupied 12 city blocks on the northeast edge of town, a sprawling campus of beige brick and sliding glass doors that smelled, everywhere and always, of antiseptic and cafeteria coffee. Emily Carter had worked the night shift in the medical surgical ward for 3 years. Before that, a year in the ER. Before that, nothing she talked about. She lived in a studio apartment 12 minutes from the hospital by bus, kept a cactus on the windowsill because she forgot to water things, and ate most of her meals standing over the kitchen sink. She was not unfriendly. She was not warm either. She answered questions directly, did her job without complaint, and had a habit of going very still when something was wrong. Not the stillness of uncertainty, but of someone calculating, precisely and quietly, what needed to happen next. Her coworkers found it unsettling. Her charge nurse, a thick-armed woman named Sandra Briggs, had described her to the unit manager as competent but odd, and that assessment had followed Emily through 3 performance reviews without anyone examining it too closely. The veteran outreach event had been Director Harlan Voss's idea. Voss ran hospital administration with the energy of a man who had watched too many TED Talks and the ethics of someone who had watched none. The event was good optics. A Saturday morning on the hospital lawn, military families, free blood pressure checks, some K-9 unit demonstrations, a banner with the hospital logo and the words Raven Ridge Cares stretched between 2 light poles. Local news had sent a camera. Voss had worn his best blazer. Emily had not planned to be there. She had come in to cover a half shift for a colleague who had called in sick, finished at 11, and was cutting across the lawn toward the bus stop when the crowd's noise changed. Not louder exactly, but different in quality, the specific pitch of people who have just realized something is wrong. She stopped. The demonstration area had been roped off near the hospital's east entrance. A portable platform, folding chairs, a podium with a microphone. The K-9 unit from Briar Station Army Base, 40 minutes south of Cedar Falls, had been scheduled to show off search and rescue techniques. There were 3 dogs. 2 of them were fine, already crated and loaded back into the transport vehicle. The third was Sergeant. He had been fine, apparently, through the first portion of the demonstration. Sat when told, tracked a scent trail, retrieved a training dummy. And then something had happened. Emily would later piece together that it was a car backfiring in the parking structure 2 blocks away. A sound that meant nothing to the humans present and meant something specific and terrible to a dog who had spent 8 years in active combat zones. And Sergeant had come apart. By the time Emily reached the edge of the crowd, 3 handlers were down. Not injured seriously, but scattered. One had dropped his lead when Sergeant lunged. The second had tripped backing away. The third was pressed against the podium, looking at the dog the way you looked at something you had decided was unsalvageable. The military veterinarian, a pale young man named Captain Driscoll, who had graduated 18 months ago, was on his radio. The tranquilizer gun was out. The 30-second timeline had already been announced to the unit commander, and the crowd was doing the thing crowds do when they're afraid. Bunching together, pulling backward, creating a pressure that made the whole scene feel like it was compressing toward a single terrible outcome. Emily watched Sargent. He was circling, which people were interpreting as aggression. He wasn't circling aggressively. He was patterning. A specific movement, a grid search, the kind of behavior drilled into a working dog so deeply it became instinct, activated now by whatever memory the backfire had triggered. He was looking for a threat. He was doing his job. His job happened to involve a set of commands and a handler he recognized, neither of which were present, and so he was doing the only thing his training allowed him to do in the absence of direction: assess, contain, protect. 30 seconds, someone announced into a radio. "You're reading him wrong," Emily said. The woman beside her, mid-40s, lanyard from the hospital administration office, the particular expression of someone who had attended many community events and found this one more inconvenient than most, looked at her. "Excuse me? He's not attacking. He's in search mode. Somebody triggered his grid protocol." The woman looked at Emily's faded scrubs, the split sneaker, the lack of any credential or uniform that would give her words institutional weight. "Ma'am, please step back from the barrier. Someone needs to tell the handler to use security." The woman raised her hand. "Can we get security over here?" A guard materialized at Emily's elbow, young and earnest and following instructions. "Ma'am, I need you to. I'm a nurse. I work here." "That's fine, but you need to stay behind the barrier." On the grass, Captain Driscoll had raised the tranquilizer gun. Sargent's head swung toward him and the quality of the dog's movement changed. Not search mode now, threat response. Because a raised weapon was something Sargent knew about, something his entire nervous system had opinions about. And if Driscoll fired and missed or hit at the wrong angle, this was going to become significantly worse very quickly. Emily put her hand on the security guard's arm, not aggressively, just to be clear she was still talking. "The tranq will escalate him. Tell them not to fire." "Ma'am, write it down if you need to. Don't fire. Tell them." The guard looked uncertain. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the crowd noise from the left. A man's voice, flat and used to being obeyed. "Hold." Captain Driscoll held. The crowd shifted, and Emily could see the speaker now. A tall man in his early 50s, military bearing, silver at his temples, uniform with the kind of insignia that made the young guard beside Emily straighten involuntarily. He was moving through the crowd from the direction of the VIP seating area, people stepping aside without being asked. Colonel Marcus Webb. Emily didn't know his name yet. She would learn it later from the name tape on his chest, in the moment after everything changed. He reached the barrier, looked at the dog, looked at his veterinarian, looked at his 3 scattered handlers. His jaw was set in the way of someone who had made decisions under worse pressure and was doing arithmetic in his head. "What are our options?" he said. Not a question exactly. Captain Driscoll began to answer. He got 2 sentences in before the woman with the administration lanyard stepped forward and said, "Colonel, one of our nurse's aides seems to have a suggestion," with exactly the tone of voice that was meant to end the conversation before it started. Webb turned. Emily was already looking at him, not at the dog now, because the dog was going to do what the dog was going to do, and she needed whoever was in charge to hear one sentence before Driscoll raised that gun again. "Don't fire," she said. "He's grid searching. He needs a recall command, not a sedative." A beat. Webb's eyes went to her scrubs, her shoes, her face. Whatever he saw there, it wasn't what he'd expected. "What's the recall?" he said. Emily hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the specific weight of saying a word she hadn't said in years, a word that belonged to a version of herself she had deliberately put down, like setting something heavy on a shelf and walking out of the room. "Depends on his unit. If he's Briar Station K9, it's a Tier 2 command, verbal plus hand signal." Something moved across Webb's face, fast and then controlled. "What's your name?" he said. "Emily Carter." The silence that followed was very brief, but Emily noticed it. Noticed the way Webb's posture changed, a fraction of a degree, something between recognition and something she couldn't name. "Hold your positions," he said to his team, then to Emily. "Show me." The next part happened fast and badly and did not look, from the outside, like anything except a civilian doing something reckless. Director Harlan Voss materialized from the direction of the VIP area at approximately the same moment Webb gave Emily permission, which meant he arrived in time to witness the colonel speaking to a woman in worn scrubs and sneakers, and to draw from this an institutional conclusion that had nothing to do with what was actually occurring. Colonel Webb. Voss stepped up to the barrier with his blazer slightly open and his smile slightly wrong. I apologize for this disruption. We have trained staff who can assist. Not now, Webb said. Voss blinked. Not many people said that to him in his own hospital. I understand, but the liability exposure if an unauthorized... I said not now! Voss turned to Emily instead. She recognized the shift, the way attention redirected by power found a softer target. I don't know who told you to get involved in this, but you need to step back and let the professionals... She's with me, Webb said. Emily had already moved. Not because Webb said she could, not because she'd been cleared or endorsed or blessed by anyone in a position of authority. She moved because Sargent had just stopped circling. He had gone still in the specific way that meant the next thing he did was going to be decisive and fast, and she had maybe 15 seconds before his threat response overtook his search conditioning entirely. She ducked under the barrier tape. Hey! The security guard reached for her. Let her through. Webb's voice was flat as a board. The guard stopped. She walked onto the grass. The handlers were still there, scattered at the edges of the demonstration area, and they watched her the way people watched someone they had already decided was wrong, with the particular attention of those waiting to be proven right. One of them, a staff sergeant with a sunburn across his nose, said, "Ma'am, you need to stay back," in the practiced tone of someone who'd said it 100 times and been obeyed every time. Emily kept walking. She didn't walk fast. That was the part people didn't understand later when they described what they'd seen. They kept saying she walked toward him like she wasn't scared, like she was brave, and they were wrong on both counts. She walked slowly because speed was information, and the information she was giving Sargent was not a threat, not fleeing, not hunting. She was none of the things his training had cataloged as dangerous. Sargent's head came around. He looked at her the way dogs looked at things they didn't have a category for. She stopped 10 feet away, dropped to one knee, not in submission, just to get her eye level below his, just to be smaller than the threat profile his nervous system had constructed. She let him look at her for 3 full seconds. She counted, which was something she'd learned a long time ago in a place far from this lawn, that 3 seconds was usually enough for a working dog's pattern recognition to catch up with his fear response. Then she used a hand signal that hadn't been part of any public K9 demonstration in years. It wasn't a common command. It was Tier 2 Briar Station Protocol, developed in 2017 for units operating in high-noise environments where verbal commands were unreliable. The signal involved the left hand, 2 fingers, a specific angle of the wrist. It meant, mission complete. Stand down. You're done. Sargent stared at her. She did it again. Something shifted in the dog's body. A physical change, like watching a fist unclench. His weight redistributed. His hackles didn't fully drop, but the set of his shoulders changed. He exhaled. A long, shuddering breath. The kind of breath that had a lot of held tension in it. Emily said, very quietly, the verbal component of the command. She said it in the specific cadence Briar Station used. The rhythm of it. Because the rhythm mattered. It was part of the conditioning, and she hadn't been certain she'd remembered it correctly until the word was out of her mouth, and Sargent's ears rotated forward. He took 1 step toward her, stopped, took another. She stayed still. Did not reach for him. Did not make a sound. Let him close the remaining distance on his own terms and at his own pace, because that was the only way this worked. The dog had to choose to come back. You couldn't drag a working dog back from where his mind had gone. You had to give him a reason to return and then wait. Sargent walked to her and pressed his head against her shoulder. The crowd made no sound for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the gathered spectators, someone exhaled the kind of breath that precedes crying and that started something, and the sound that came next was complicated. Relief and shock, and something like shame. The specific shame of having watched something and been wrong about what it was. Captain Driscoll still had the tranquilizer gun. He lowered it. Emily sat on the grass with her hands on Sargent's rib cage, feeling the dog breathe. feeling the shuddering tension work itself out of his muscles one increment at a time. She was aware of footsteps approaching. Webb, she thought, and one of the handlers. But she didn't look up yet. She needed to be sure Sargent was all the way back before she introduced new variables. "Easy," she said, barely audible. "Easy. You're done. You're done." Sargent made a sound in his chest. Not a growl, not a whimper, something in between. The sound of a highly trained animal trying to locate itself after a place it had been dragged back from involuntarily. Webb stopped 3 feet away. He looked at the dog, then at Emily. "Where did you learn that signal?" he said. It was not a casual question. Emily didn't answer immediately. She scratched behind Sargent's ears, felt the dog lean into it with the totality of something that had been running on adrenaline for 20 minutes and was now profoundly exhausted. "Briar Station," she said, 2016 to 2019. Webb was quiet for a moment. "You were 3rd Special Medical Battalion," he said. "K9 Trauma Attachment." Emily looked up for the first time. "You have a good memory, Colonel." "I have a good memory," he agreed. "I also have a file. You're hard to find when you don't want to be found." Around them, people had begun to talk again, the crowd noise reassembling itself from shocked silence back to the regular texture of a public event, but different now, charged. She could hear Voss's voice somewhere to her left, the administrative register of someone managing a narrative in real time. She could hear one of the handlers on a radio. She could hear, underneath all of it, Sargent's breathing, gradually steadying. "Why didn't you want to be found?" Webb said. She didn't answer. He let it go for now. "Dr. Driscoll, get a crate, slowly." He looked at his handlers. "Nobody approaches without my direct order." Driscoll moved. The handler with the sunburned nose had gone quiet in the way of someone who had recently been very confident and was recalibrating. Director Voss arrived at Webb's elbow. His voice had the controlled pleasantness of someone furious in managing it. "Colonel, I want to apologize for any confusion during the event. We're going to need to discuss the liability implications of allowing an unsanctioned—" "She's not unsanctioned," Webb said. "She just wasn't known to you." Voss smiled the specific smile of a man who was about to explain the difference. "With respect, Colonel, this is a hospital event on hospital grounds, and the personnel protocols—" "Mr. Voss." Webb turned to look at him for the first time. "This woman just prevented your staff from euthanizing a decorated military working dog based on a misread behavioral assessment. I'd like you to take a moment before you finish that sentence." Voss finished it anyway. He was that kind of man. "She's a floor nurse," Voss said. "A night shift nurse, not even full-time. She has no credentials in animal behavior, no military—" "You're wrong about that," Webb said. Voss looked at Emily. The reassessment happening on his face was visible and ungenerous. The specific recalculation of someone who has dismissed a person and is now considering, not whether they were wrong to dismiss them, but whether the dismissal is going to cause problems for them personally. "Her file," Voss said, and Emily heard the shift in his voice, from confidence to something more careful. "You have a file on her?" "I do." "And what exactly does it—" "That's classified." Webb said it the way he'd said "not now," not loudly, just with a finality that closed the door on the next 5 questions before they were asked. He looked back at Emily. "How long have you been at Raven Ridge?" 3 years. As a nurse. As a nurse. He was quiet for a moment, watching Sargent's breathing. "And before that?" "Before that," Emily said, "I wasn't." Webb had the discipline not to push. The investigation he was already running in his head would answer those questions faster than she would, and they both knew it. Sargent had stopped shaking. He was lying on his side now, pressed against Emily's leg, and the complete absence of tension in his body was striking compared to what it had been 20 minutes ago. She stroked his flank and thought about what the dog was feeling. Not recovery exactly, not rest, more like the specific relief of being released from something that had been pulling at you. She understood the feeling. She had some experience with it. From across the grass, she heard the handler with the sunburned nose talking to one of his colleagues. She couldn't make out most of it, but she heard one phrase clearly. Protocol she used hasn't been deployed since the Molly extraction. And then she heard the second handler say, in a lower voice, "Carter. Wait, is that—" She didn't turn around. Webb crouched beside her. He was looking at Sargent, but his voice was for her. He's going to need a proper assessment, medical workup, behavioral evaluation, someone who understands what the combat conditioning does over a long deployment. I know. His entire rehabilitation plan has been wrong. I know that too. You saw it from the crowd. She didn't answer that as a statement of pride because she didn't experience it that way. She had seen it the way a mechanic noticed a specific sound in an engine. Recognition, not skill, or skill so internalized it was indistinguishable from instinct. They nearly killed him for responding exactly the way they trained him to respond, she said. He heard a threat signal, and he went into grid protocol. That's not aggression. She stopped. That's not aggression. No, Webb said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment, watching the dog. The people who filed this euthanasia recommendation, he said, they have credentials, training, years of experience. I know. And they were wrong. Yes. Webb stood. He looked across the grass at Captain Driscoll, who was standing with the tranquilizer gun lowered, and an expression that was somewhere between relief and a reckoning he wasn't ready for. Driscoll, he said, I want a full incident report on my desk by Monday, and I want Sargent's behavioral assessments from the last 6 months pulled. Driscoll nodded. His face had gone careful. All of them, Webb said, not the summary, the source documentation. There was a shift in the air, the specific atmospheric change of a process starting that was going to be uncomfortable for several people. Emily felt it without looking at anyone in particular. She was still sitting on the grass with her hand on Sargent's flank, and she was watching the sky begin to change color as the morning pushed toward noon, and she was thinking about the fact that she had spent 3 years making herself unremarkable on purpose. 3 years of night shifts and split sneakers, and not being the person who drew attention, and in approximately 40 minutes she had undone all of it. Voss was speaking to someone on his phone. She caught the phrase legal exposure and chain of command and I need someone from HR available this afternoon. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at Webb. He was looking at the camera from the local news station, which had recorded everything. The woman with the administration lanyard was also looking at the camera, and then she was looking at Emily. And whatever she'd expected to find in that look, the face of a presumptuous aide, an embarrassment, someone who had made a scene and would need to be managed, wasn't what was there. Emily didn't know what was on her face. She was thinking about a dog that had come back from somewhere dark. And she was thinking about 3 years of deliberately being nobody. And she was thinking about the fact that Marcus Webb had said he had a file. She was thinking about what was in that file. She was thinking about the reason there was a file. Sargent made a soft sound. Not distressed, just checking in. And she scratched his ear automatically, the way you responded to something without deciding to respond. Webb was speaking to his handlers. She could hear him assigning tasks, his voice carrying the same flat efficiency it always had, the voice of someone who had stopped letting difficulties surprise them. She had known voices like that before. She had, at one point, had a voice like that herself. Behind her, she heard someone in the crowd say, "Who is she?" And someone else answer, "I don't know, she works here." And someone else say, "She doesn't look like," and then trail off because the end of that sentence was going to sound a certain way, and the speaker had become aware of that. The news camera was still running. Emily became aware for the first time in years of the specific quality of being looked at by many people at once, not the ordinary clinical attention of a hospital shift, not the brisk functional regard of a charge nurse or a patient, but the slower and more complicated gaze of people who had witnessed something and were now revising the story they'd been telling themselves. Webb turned back to her. His expression had settled into something she recognized. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of steady attention that had professional respect running underneath it. "We're going to need to talk," he said. "I know. Today." "I assumed." He looked at her for a moment. "You knew I had a file." She met his eyes. "I knew you'd find one." Something shifted in his face, not softening, but acknowledging. He had expected to meet a runaway. He had found something he hadn't fully categorized yet. "There are questions," he said, "about the mission, about 2019, about why a specialist with your record walked away and disappeared into a hospital floor for 3 years." Emily looked down at Sargent. The dog's eyes were half closed. His breathing was slow. He had, in the last 45 minutes, come back from what his body had understood as an active war zone, been contained by a woman he had never met, and gone to sleep on a hospital lawn in the American Midwest. She thought about what that kind of trust cost. "I'll answer the questions," she said. "Some of them. Some of them. The ones that are yours to ask." Webb was quiet for a moment, then, "Fair enough." He turned to go, back to his handlers, his incident report, the complicated machinery of institutional accountability that was already starting to turn. He stopped after 2 steps. "Carter," she looked up, "the euthanasia order on Sargent is suspended pending investigation." He said it carefully, the way you said things that had weight. "Effective now." Emily nodded. He walked away. She sat on the grass in her split sneakers and her faded scrubs, with a sleeping combat dog against her leg and the Cedar Falls sun overhead, and she was aware that 3 years of being nobody had just ended in less than an hour. She didn't know yet what would come out of the investigation. She didn't know what Webb's file actually contained, which parts of the record were accurate and which were shaped by the particular way institutions told stories about people they had lost. She didn't know what Voss was planning, but she knew what she had seen in that dog's eyes when he'd come back from wherever the backfire had sent him. The specific disorientation of a trained thing trying to locate itself in a world that had stopped making sense. And she knew, in a way she hadn't known anything clearly in 3 years, what she was going to do next. Sargent exhaled. His paw twitched. Some dream, some echo, some piece of the morning working itself out of his system. Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. The number on the screen was the hospital's main administrative line. It was Director Voss. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she answered. "Carter," Voss said before she even got the phone to her ear. Not a greeting. A summons compressed into a single word, the way certain people said names when they wanted you to understand the conversation had already been decided. "My office. 20 minutes. She looked at Sargent, still sleeping against her leg. His breathing had evened out completely, the long, unconscious rhythm of an animal that had burned through its entire emergency reserve and needed time to refill it. "I'm with the dog," she said. A pause. Brief, but loaded. "The dog is a military matter. My office is a hospital matter. 20 minutes, Carter. Don't make me send someone." He hung up. She sat for another minute, not because she was stalling. She knew exactly what was waiting in that office, had known the shape of it from the moment Webb walked away and left her with the news camera still rolling and Voss's face doing its careful math, but because Sargent's weight against her leg was the only thing in the last hour that had felt uncomplicated, and she was rationing that feeling for as long as it was available. One of the handlers approached eventually, moving carefully, which was the right thing to do. Young, female, the kind of controlled competence that came from actual training rather than just confidence. Her name tape said Reyes. "I can take him," Reyes said. "I've worked with him before. He knows me." Emily looked at her. "Not the crate. He needs open space for the next hour at least. The crate will reset the stress response." Reyes hesitated. Not defensively, she was actually thinking about it. "There's a grassed area on the north side of the transport vehicle." "That works." "Okay." Reyes crouched down, waited for Sargent to register her presence in his own time. "The colonel wants a full observation log started. I'll sit with him. Watch his left foreleg. There's a compensation pattern when he walks. Someone missed an injury somewhere." Reyes looked up. "How can you tell? He's been lying still." The way he was distributing his weight when he was circling, favoring it slightly. Emily got to her feet, dusting grass off her scrubs. "It's probably old, but get it documented." She left Sargent and walked toward the main building, and she did not look back at the crowd, which had thinned but not fully dispersed, people still standing in small clusters doing the thing people did after unexpected events, replaying it, revising their understanding of what they'd seen, quietly deciding what version of the story they were going to carry home. Voss's office was on the 4th floor of the administrative wing, which was separated from the clinical areas by a set of glass doors and a different quality of carpet. Everything on the administrative floor was slightly newer and slightly quieter than the rest of the building, as though institutional priorities had been made legible through renovation schedules. His assistant, a young man named Terrence, who had the harried look of someone managing more than he'd signed up for, gave Emily a slightly too long look when she came through the outer office, still in her grass-stained scrubs. He didn't say anything. He pressed the intercom button and announced her name. Voss was standing when she entered, which was the tell. He'd considered whether to sit or stand and decided standing was more authoritative. There was a second person in the room, Sandra Briggs, Emily's charge nurse, who was seated in one of the chairs in front of Voss's desk and had the expression of someone who'd been brought in to serve a function they weren't entirely comfortable with. Emily took the chair beside Sandra without being invited to. Voss remained standing for a moment longer, then sat. He placed his hands on the desk in the careful way of someone who had once read something about body language projecting control. "I want to be clear," he said, "that this is not a disciplinary meeting." "Okay," Emily said. "It's a conversation about an unusual situation." "Okay." He waited, probably for her to fill the silence. She didn't. "What happened on the lawn today," Voss said, "was unexpected. And I understand that the outcome was that the dog is fine. That's good. I want to acknowledge that." He paused. "However, you entered a secured event area without authorization, engaged with a dangerous animal against the direct instruction of hospital security. Security deferred to Colonel Webb," Emily said. "Webb gave authorization." "Colonel Webb is not a Raven Ridge employee." "No, but it was a Briar Station K9. His operational authority over that animal supersedes hospital protocol in an active incident." Sandra made a small sound beside her, not agreement, not dissent, just the noise of someone wishing they were elsewhere. Voss's expression did something complex. He hadn't expected her to know that. Most floor nurses wouldn't have. "Be that as it may," he said, "the liability exposure for this hospital, if you had been injured—" "I wasn't injured." "Emily." Sandra's voice was quiet and careful, the tone of someone trying to signal something without saying it in front of the wrong person. "I think what Director Voss is trying to establish is—" "I know what he's trying to establish," Emily said. She looked at Voss. "You want a record that shows you raised concerns before whatever this becomes. That's fine. Raise them. I'll sign whatever you need signed." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know. I've had your file for 3 years." He opened a folder on his desk, an actual paper folder, which struck her as deliberate, a performance of institutional thoroughness. "Night shift MSurg. Good patient outcomes, no formal complaints. A couple of notes from Sandra here about—" "How did you put it, Sandra?" Sandra shifted. "I described her as self-directed," she said, which was not what she'd said in the performance reviews, and they all knew it. "Self-directed," Voss repeated. "There's nothing here about military service, nothing about specialized training, nothing about whatever that was on the lawn." "I didn't include it in my application." "Why not?" Emily looked at him steadily. "Because it wasn't relevant to the nursing position." The folder sat between them. Voss didn't close it, but he wasn't looking at it anymore. He was looking at her with the particular attention of someone recalculating a position they'd committed to. "Colonel Webb wants to speak with you this afternoon," he said. "Formally, in a meeting that will include his JAG officer and a representative from Briar Station's K9 program." "I know." "Do you have legal representation?" The question landed with a specific weight. Emily heard it for what it was, not concern, an assessment of how much trouble she was going to cause him. "Should I need it?" she said. Voss's hands moved on the desk. Small adjustment, slightly less controlled. "That's not something I can advise you on." "Then I don't have it." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man storing information. Then, "I'm going to need you off the floor for the remainder of the day, pending the outcome of the colonel's meeting." "Off the floor." "With pay," he added quickly. "This isn't a suspension, it's—" "Administrative leave while you figure out what happened," Emily said. Sandra winced. Voss straightened. "That's a somewhat reductive characterization." "But accurate." The silence in the room had a particular texture. Through the fourth-floor window, Emily could see a slice of the east lawn, the event barriers still standing, a few hospital staff in the distance breaking down the folding chairs. The podium was still up, the banner still stretched between its light poles. Raven Ridge Cares. "Is there anything else?" she asked. Voss looked at the folder, closed it. "Webb's team will contact you directly to arrange the meeting time. In the meantime," he seemed to reconsider something, tried a different angle. "Emily, you're clearly capable of more than a night shift rotation on MSurg. If this situation resolves cleanly, there are opportunities at this hospital." "I appreciate that," she said, standing. "We can talk about it when the situation resolves." She left Sandra still sitting in the chair. She heard, as the office door closed behind her, Voss say something in a low voice, and Sandra respond, and then neither of them said anything else that she could make out. Terence gave her the same look on the way out. This time, she gave it back until he looked away. Tats. The meeting with Webb's team was scheduled for 3 o'clock, which left her 4 hours in a city she knew mostly through bus routes and night shift rhythms. She went home and changed out of the scrubs, put on jeans and a gray shirt and the other pair of sneakers, the ones without the split seam, and stood in her kitchen for a while, not eating anything. She thought about the file. She'd spent 3 years knowing it existed somewhere and choosing not to think about it, which was a different thing from not thinking about it. The file was the shape of everything she'd left behind, reduced to documentation, dates and locations and incident reports, and, at the end of it, the specific language of a formal inquiry she'd never fully answered. The mission, 2019. The thing she'd walked away from and kept walking. She made coffee she didn't drink and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the cactus on the windowsill and thought about Sargent's weight against her leg and the sound he'd made when he came back from wherever the backfire had sent him. She pulled out her phone and looked up something she hadn't searched for in a long time. Staff Sergeant Dario Mendez, 3rd Battalion, Briar Station. K9 Handler, 2016 to 2019. The results came back the same as they always had. A unit commendation article from 2018, a local paper feature about a fundraiser, and then nothing. Nothing after March 2019. She put the phone face down on the mattress. The meeting. She had to get through the meeting. Webb had commandeered a conference room on the 2nd floor of the hospital's administrative wing. Not Voss's territory, but adjacent to it, which was probably intentional. When Emily arrived, there were already 4 people at the table. Webb, his JAG officer, a composed woman named Major Tricia Hollenbeck, who shook Emily's hand with the calm efficiency of someone who had been in many rooms like this and expected to be in many more, a man Emily didn't recognize in civilian clothes with the specific posture of institutional authority, and Captain Driscoll, who looked like he'd spent the last 4 hours either preparing very carefully for something or dreading it. The civilian introduced himself as Russell Page from the Department of Defense's Working Dog Program Oversight Office. He had a tablet and the expression of a man who'd been pulled away from something else and was working out whether this warranted the interruption. They gave her water. Nobody offered anything else. Webb opened. "Emily, I want to be upfront about what this meeting is and what it isn't. You're not under investigation. This is a fact-finding conversation. You can stop at any time and nothing you say here will be used against you in any formal proceeding without your explicit consent." He paused. "Major Hollenbeck will make sure of that." Hollenbeck nodded once. "Okay," Emily said. Page looked up from his tablet. "Ms. Carter, you used a Tier 2 Briar Station recall command on Sargent this morning. That command set was last operationally deployed in the Mali extraction in March of 2019. He let the sentence sit for a moment. "You were part of that extraction." "Yes," she said. "As a combat medic. Attached to 3rd Special Medical Battalion, K9 Trauma Support." "Yes." Driscoll had his hands flat on the table. Emily noticed he was very carefully not looking at her. "Sergeant," Page continued, "was deployed in that extraction. His handler at that time was Staff Sergeant Dario Mendez." Another pause. "Staff Sergeant Mendez was KIA in the final phase of the extraction. You were present. The room was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people waiting for someone to say something wrong, but the more specific quiet of people who already knew the shape of what was coming. I was present, Emily said. You were the last medical personnel to reach Mendez before. Yes. Her voice was flat, and she knew it. She couldn't make it otherwise right now. Can we? She stopped, tried again. Is this relevant to what happened this morning? Because if you're building to the inquiry, I'd rather address that directly. Webb looked at her. It's relevant to why you're here, to who you are. I know who I am. Sergeant doesn't, he said, or didn't until this morning. That dog has been through 6 handlers since the extraction. Every behavioral assessment in the last 3 years has described him as deteriorating, increasingly unpredictable, and likely for humane euthanasia. He leaned forward slightly. You walked across 30 feet of grass and recalled him with a command nobody's used on him in 6 years. So yes, the context is relevant. She looked at the water glass. Didn't pick it up. After the extraction, she said carefully, I filed an incident report. I requested a formal review of the unit's field protocol on handler casualties and canine recovery procedures. The review was, she stopped, chose the word correctly, deprioritized. I was told the incident had been sufficiently documented. Page's expression shifted. Who told you that? My commanding officer at the time, Colonel, then Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Hatch. Something passed between Webb and Page, quick and not intended for her. Hatch, Page said very carefully, has not been in that role for 2 years. I know. She'd looked it up 6 months ago, at 2 in the morning, standing at her kitchen counter. I saw the announcement. His departure was not voluntary, Webb said. That's not public information, and I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know. His departure was connected to a pattern of suppressed incident reports. Yours is not the only one. Emily looked at him. Your review request was not deprioritized, Hollenbeck said, her voice precise and unhurried. It was actively buried. There's a difference. And we found it. The cactus on the windowsill, the studio apartment, 3 years of night shifts, of making herself small and unremarkable, of carrying a weight she'd been told was the natural consequence of what happened in the field, not the consequence of what had been deliberately hidden. Her hands were on the table and she didn't let them move. What does that mean? She said. It means the formal inquiry, the one that was opened after the extraction and then closed after Hatch's intervention, has been reopened, Hollenbeck said. Not against you. The review of your conduct in the field has been reviewed, independently, 3 reviewers. Emily was very still. You did everything right, Webb said. It landed simply, without ceremony, the way things landed when people meant them. Everything. The extraction timeline, the triage sequence, Mendez. You followed protocol and you made 2 field decisions under fire that saved the lives of 3 other personnel who would have died if you hadn't deviated from the stated plan. The incident report you filed was accurate. The protocol failure was not yours. The conference room had a window on the east wall. Late afternoon light came through it at a low angle, throwing a pale bar across the table between them. Hatch told me, Emily said, and her voice was still flat, but the edges of it were doing something she couldn't fully control. That the field decisions I made were the reason Mendez didn't get timely support, that I had prioritized incorrectly, that I would need to live with that. He lied, Webb said, simply, directly. He lied to protect a protocol failure in his own command structure. You were the easy target. You were junior, you were attached rather than assigned, and you left the service 6 months later, which made it easier to let the narrative stand. She didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the hospital building, a door opened and closed. A PA system announced something about a patient pickup. The ordinary texture of the building continued around them, indifferent. I need a minute, Emily said. Nobody said anything. Webb nodded. Hollenbeck folded her hands and looked at the table. Page set his tablet down. She took the minute. Then, what happens next? Page picked up his tablet. Several things, some immediate and some longer term. Immediately, Sergeant's euthanasia recommendation is formally suspended and a new behavioral assessment has been ordered. We'd like you involved in that assessment if you're willing. He swiped. His current rehabilitation handlers, the team from Briar Station's civilian contractor Colvin Group, are being reviewed. Based on what you identified this morning, there's probable cause to examine the accuracy of their previous assessments. Their assessments weren't just inaccurate, Emily said. They were dangerous. They've been treating grid search behavior as aggression for months. Every intervention they made was the wrong one. It would have made him worse every time. We know that now, Webb said. Did they know it? Or did they not know it? Webb looked at her. That, he said, is what the investigation is going to determine. She absorbed that. And Hatch? Hatch's situation is already in motion. The suppressed reports are part of a larger IG investigation. You'll be asked to provide a formal statement. It's voluntary, but I'll do it, she said before he finished the sentence. I've been waiting 6 years to do it. Webb nodded. Something in his face, not relief, but the recognition of a long overdue thing arriving. Driscoll cleared his throat. It was the first sound he'd made since introductions, and everyone looked at him. He seemed briefly startled by his own nerve. I want to say... He stopped. Started again. I want to formally acknowledge, for the record, that I was about to administer a lethal sedative to a healthy responding animal based on an assessment I did not independently verify. His voice was steady, but barely. I accepted the Colvin Group's documentation without review. That was, he looked at the table, that was a significant failure of my professional responsibility. And I'm aware that's inadequate, but I need it said. The room was quiet. Okay, Emily said. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't the opposite either. It was just acknowledgement of the fact that he'd said it. The meeting went on for another 40 minutes. There were forms, preliminary ones, the beginning of a paper trail that would expand considerably in the weeks to come. Hollenbeck was thorough and patient and asked her questions in the careful language of someone building something that would need to hold up under scrutiny. Paige wanted specifics about what she'd observed in Sargent's behavior, not for the record, he said, but because he was trying to understand the gap between what the Colvin Group had documented and what she had seen. She told him. All of it. The weight distribution, the grid pattern, the specific indicators that differentiated combat conditioning engagement from aggression, the way a trained eye read a dog's body at distance, the knowledge that had been so central to her identity for 3 years in the service that she had spent 3 years in a hospital trying to be sure she couldn't accidentally deploy it. Paige listened with the concentration of someone who was revising something important. At the end, Webb walked her to the elevator. Hollenbeck and Paige stayed behind, the beginning of a longer conversation she wasn't part of. One more thing, Webb said when they reached the lobby level. She looked at him. The Colvin Group's contract with Briar Station for K-9 behavioral services. He said it carefully. It's valued at $3.8 million. Their principal is a man named Douglas Colvin. He's not a military veteran, not a trained behaviorist. He's a businessman who acquired 2 smaller animal training operations and built a service contract on the combined credentials of the staff he absorbed. A pause. One of those staff members is the handler who filed the euthanasia recommendation on Sargent this morning. Emily processed this. How long has Colvin Group had the contract? 4 years. And how many dogs have been? 7, Webb said. 7 animals euthanized under their care in 4 years, all for documented behavioral grounds. He let that sit. We're reviewing those cases now. The lobby doors slid open behind her. Cedar Falls afternoon light came through, warm and unhurried, the sky doing nothing dramatic. 7 dogs. Douglas Colvin, she said. Is he aware of the investigation? He is not, Webb said. As of this morning, he believes today's incident was a procedural embarrassment that will be managed internally. He looked at her. He made 2 phone calls in the last hour, one to his contract liaison at Briar Station, one to a member of the hospital board. Emily was quiet for a moment. Voss, she said. Voss, Webb confirmed. She stood in the lobby doorway with the afternoon light at her back and thought about the phone call she'd taken on the grass and what Voss had actually been calling about, and what the man had meant when he'd said there were opportunities at this hospital and then stopped talking. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at it. Unknown number. Local area code. She answered. Emily Carter? The voice was male, professional, the deliberate cadence of someone who made calls like this regularly. "My name is Douglas Colvin. I think we should talk before the situation gets away from both of us." She looked at Webb. He hadn't heard the call. He was watching her face. Whatever he read there made him go very still. "Mr. Colvin," Emily said, keeping her voice completely level, "how did you get this number?" A pause on the line. When Colvin spoke again, there was something beneath the professional tone that hadn't been there a moment ago. Something that might have been, in another person, embarrassment. In him, it presented as calculation. "Let's just say," he said, "that some mutual friends thought it would be better for everyone if we spoke directly." Emily kept her eyes on Webb. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm available to meet," she said. "When were you thinking?" "Tonight. There's a restaurant on 5th called Harlow's, 7 o'clock. I'd like to—" He chose the word carefully. "Clarify a few things. My organization's work with Briar Station has been exceptional, and I think you may have misread the situation with the dog. I can explain. 7 o'clock at Harlow's," she said. "I'll be there." She ended the call. Webb was looking at her with his phone in his hand. "Tell me that was who I think it was." "Douglas Colvin wants to meet tonight, privately, before the investigation moves forward." She held up her phone. "Someone gave him my personal number." Webb dialed something, raised his phone to his ear. His jaw had gone to a particular set she recognized from the lawn, the arithmetic face, the deciding what happens next face. "Hollenbeck," he said into his phone. "We have a problem." The next 6 hours moved the way hours moved before something broke, too fast in the wrong places and too slow everywhere else. Hollenbeck arrived back in the lobby 4 minutes after Webb's call, Page behind her with his jacket off and his tablet open, the shift in their energy immediate and legible. They moved to a corner of the lobby away from the front desk and the two people waiting in plastic chairs, and Webb laid it out in 30 seconds. Colvin had called Emily's personal number within 2 hours of the incident, had proposed a private meeting, had used the phrase mutual friends. Hollenbeck listened without interrupting. "Who has your number?" she said to Emily. "Hospital HR. My direct supervisor. My emergency contact, who is my neighbor." Emily ran through it. "Webb's team got it through the base registry when they pulled my service file. That happened today." "So it came from either the hospital or from us," Hollenbeck said. "Or from someone with access to both," Page said. Webb looked at him. "Voss made 2 calls, one to Colvin." "That's not confirmed," Hollenbeck said. "It'll be confirmed by morning." Webb's voice was flat. "The question is what we do with the 7 o'clock meeting." Emily had been waiting for this part. "I go." Hollenbeck shook her head, not dismissively, but as a starting position. "You go to a private dinner with the subject of an active review, without counsel, without—" "He doesn't know there's an active review," Emily said. "He thinks this is still manageable. He thinks I'm a floor nurse who got lucky with a dog, and he can offer me something to go quiet." She looked at Hollenbeck. "If I don't go, he finds another way to manage it. If I go, we find out what he thinks he has and who he thinks he has it with." "You're not law enforcement," Page said, but not like an objection, like a fact he was laying on the table. "I know what I am." Hollenbeck exchanged a look with Webb. "You'd be wearing a wire." "Fine. That means a consent briefing, a technical setup, and someone in the room." "Tell me where to be." It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was clean. Hollenbeck made clear twice that Emily could withdraw at any point and the investigation would proceed without this avenue. Webb made clear once that Colvin was not a physical threat as far as their intelligence indicated, but that as far as their intelligence indicated was doing real work in that sentence, and Emily should weigh it accordingly. She weighed it, said she'd be ready by 6. She took a cab home, changed into something that didn't look like she'd been planning anything, and sat for 20 minutes in the silence of her apartment with the cactus and the low late light and the specific quality of a room that had been lived in alone for a long time. She wasn't afraid. She had been afraid in places where the fear was rational and immediate and had learned through repetition that it was mostly information, a signal to pay attention, not a signal to stop. What she felt now was something cooler and more deliberate than fear. She thought about 7 dogs. She put on her jacket and went back outside. Harlow's was the kind of restaurant that existed in every mid-sized American city in the same iteration: exposed brick, low lighting, a bar that took itself seriously, a menu with 4 things on it that cost too much, and 6 things that cost exactly enough. Douglas Colvin was already there when Emily arrived at 6:58, seated at a corner table with a glass of red wine and the particular ease of a man who had reserved the table in advance and tipped the host to keep the neighboring tables clear. He was 60, approximately, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had been athletic and hadn't entirely given it up, though the overall impression was of someone who had made a career out of projecting capability rather than demonstrating it. His handshake was calibrated. "Emily." First names immediately. "Thank you for coming. I know this has been an unusual day." "That's one way to put it," she said. She sat. A server materialized and she ordered water, and Colvin watched that with the slight recalibration of a man who had planned this conversation around the social lubricant of shared drinks and was now adjusting. "I want to be direct," he said, which was what people said when they had decided on a specific indirect approach and wanted credit for the other kind. "My organization has done important work for Briar Station. 4 years, a significant investment of resources, genuinely improved outcomes for the animals in our care. What happened today—" He paused, touching his wine glass without lifting it. "Today was unfortunate. A specific animal with a complex history had an acute behavioral episode during a public event. My team's assessment of that animal has been consistent and documented, and I think if you look at the full record—" "7 dogs," Emily said. He stopped. "In 4 years, 7 euthanasia recommendations, all accepted, all carried out." She kept her voice conversational. "What were the behavioral grounds on the first one?" A shift in his expression. Not panic. He wasn't the type, but the adjustment of someone who had expected a different opening move. "Each case is individually documented and reviewed. I'm not asking about the documentation. I'm asking what the dog was doing that led your team to recommend euthanasia." "I don't carry individual case files in my head." "You don't remember one dog in 4 years?" "Emily." The first name again, deployed now as a gentle pressure. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. I reached out because I have respect for what you did today. Genuinely. You have an obvious skill set, and I'd like to understand it better, because, frankly, the kind of instinct you demonstrated—" "Stop." He stopped. "You called me within 2 hours of an incident involving your organization's work. You got my personal phone number from someone inside this hospital, or inside the base, neither of which is appropriate. You asked for a private meeting before any formal review has been announced." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to understand what you think this conversation is going to accomplish." The restaurant moved around them. Low music, the soft percussion of other tables, a server threading between chairs. Colvin looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke again, the calibrated warmth was gone. "There's an investigation coming," he said. "I'm not naive. Colonel Webb has been looking for a reason to review my contract for 2 years, and today handed him one." He lifted his wine glass finally and drank from it. "What I want to know is what you saw, specifically. Because there's a difference between a nurse who got lucky with a calming technique and a specialist who understands what's in that behavioral record and what it means." "Why does that matter to you?" "Because if you genuinely understand the documentation," Colvin said, "then we can have a productive conversation about what the record shows and what it doesn't. And if you're going to be a witness in a formal review, I'd like to understand the scope of what you intend to say." It was remarkably candid, she thought, for a man who still believed this meeting was private. "Your handler," she said, "the one who filed the euthanasia recommendation. What's his name?" "My team members are—" "Is it someone your company absorbed when you acquired Precision K9 Services in 2021? His jaw tightened, slightly. She'd have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. Precision K9 Services was a name she'd pulled up in the hour before she left her apartment. A small operation out of Oklahoma, 2 trainers, a specific methodology that had become briefly controversial in working dog circles for its handling of combat-conditioned animals. She'd found the acquisition mentioned in a trade publication, buried in a business section item about Colvin Group's expansion. She hadn't been certain it was relevant until she watched Colvin's face. "That acquisition," he started. Brought you 2 handlers with a track record and a methodology and a set of certifications that looked good on a contract proposal, she said. And then those handlers applied that methodology to combat-conditioned military working dogs, which is a different animal. Not metaphorically, literally, physiologically different in terms of conditioning depth and stress response. And when those dogs presented behaviors that conflicted with the methodology, the answer was always escalating intervention and eventual euthanasia, because that's what the methodology produced, and your handlers didn't know enough to know the methodology was wrong. Colvin had gone very still. That's not negligence in the malicious sense, Emily continued. That's the particular danger of people who are competent at one thing being contracted to do a related but different thing and not knowing the difference. Except that 7 dogs are dead, and 1 almost died today, and someone needs to account for that. You don't know... He stopped. Tried again. You can't demonstrate. I don't have to. She held his gaze. The documentation does it. Your own behavioral assessments, read by someone who understands what combat conditioning looks like, demonstrate it. That's what the review is going to show. The silence between them had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of a negotiation. It was something closer to the silence after a structure gives way. What do you want? Colvin said. Quietly. The professional affect was still there, but underneath it, something had gone hollow. I want the assessments, Emily said. All of them. Every behavioral record from every animal in your Briar Station contract. I want them submitted to the review board, unedited, by Monday morning. He looked at her. And if they're submitted, then you've cooperated with a federal review. That matters. And if they're not, then whoever is conducting the review will subpoena them, and the subpoena will be part of the record, and the reason for the subpoena will be part of the record. She paused. You're a businessman, Mr. Colvin. You understand how those records look different depending on how they arrive. He understood. She could see him understanding it, the way you saw someone absorb a loss in real time. Not dramatically, just a settling, like something contracting under pressure. He looked at his wine glass, set it down. The meeting with Voss, he said. It was Voss who suggested I call you. He said you were a problem that could be managed if approached correctly. He said it with the specific flatness of a man distributing blame at the exact moment it stopped being useful to hold it alone. Emily said nothing. I want that on record, Colvin said. If there's a wire... He looked up, met her eyes. And I think there is. I want it on record that Voss initiated contact between us and characterized this as a management situation. I'm not in a position to make you any guarantees, she said. No, he said. I suppose not. He signaled the server for the check, though he'd had half his wine. The restaurant continued around them, warm and indifferent. The assessments, she said. Monday. Monday, he said. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was the sound of a door closing on something. Dem. She was outside on the sidewalk in the November cool air when her phone rang again. This time it was Reyes, the handler from the morning, the careful, competent one who'd taken Sargent to the grassed area. Carter. Reyes's voice was tight in a way it hadn't been before. You need to come back to the base, now. What happened? Sargent collapsed about 40 minutes ago. He's in the veterinary facility. Said Dr. Driscoll's with him, but it's not a behavioral thing. He's got a fever, elevated white count, significant pain response in the left foreleg. A pause. You said to document the compensation pattern. I did. Driscoll thinks he's been masking a chronic infection, possibly bone involvement. The Colvin team's last wellness check was 6 weeks ago, and they documented him as physically unremarkable. Reyes's voice was very controlled and very angry underneath the control. 6 weeks ago. Emily was already moving toward the street, hand up for a cab. How bad? So Driscoll says he needs emergency intervention tonight. He's been running this infection for possibly months. The behavioral deterioration, the reactivity, the aggression flags. She stopped. He wasn't losing his mind. He was in pain. He's been in pain the whole time. Emily got into a cab, gave the driver the base address. Her hands in her lap were very still. It wasn't just a missed behavioral assessment. It wasn't just a wrong methodology. The Colvin Group's handlers had been documenting a physically ill animal as behaviorally disturbed for months, possibly longer, recommending escalating interventions, and eventually euthanasia for a dog that needed a course of antibiotics and a surgical consult. "Is Webb there?" she said. "He is now," Reyes said. Yeah. He's not happy." "Tell Driscoll I'm coming. Tell him I want to see the original wellness documentation from the last 18 months the moment I walk in." She ended the call and looked out the cab window at Cedar Falls scrolling past, the flat streets, the lit signs, the unremarkable ordinary surface of a city that had no idea what was happening inside one of its buildings. The infection timeline, once Driscoll laid it out, was going to be specific and damning. A dog showing chronic pain behaviors documented as aggression. A dog whose physical decline had been misread, month after month, by people whose contract required them to get it right. And somewhere in that documentation, she was almost certain now, there would be a wellness check signed off by someone who had either not performed it or performed it badly enough that it amounted to the same thing. She thought about the phrase Reyes had used, possibly bone involvement. She thought about what that meant for how long Sargent had been living with it. The cab pulled up to the base gate. Emily leaned forward to give her name to the guard, and as she did, her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. Different from Colvin's earlier number, not local, the area code of a city she knew from 3 years ago in a way she'd been trying to forget. The message was 4 words. "We need to talk." And below it, a name. A name she hadn't heard anyone say out loud since the morning of March 14th, 2019, in a field in Mali, in the last 30 seconds before everything went wrong. The name on her phone was Dario Mendez. She sat with that for 3 full seconds in the back of the cab, the base gate 15 feet ahead, the guard waiting for her credentials. Then she put the phone in her pocket, gave her name, and got out of the cab when the gate lifted. She filed it. Not away. She couldn't put it away. The name had too much weight. It occupied too much space in the architecture of the last 6 years. But to the side, the way you filed things in the field when you needed both hands. Deal with what's in front of you. Sargent was in front of her. Reyes met her at the entrance to the veterinary facility, a low building behind the main operations block, institutional and practical, the smell of animal and antiseptic coming through the door before it opened fully. Driscoll was inside, in scrubs now, instead of his uniform, bent over a table with the particular focus of someone who had already made 2 decisions and was in the middle of a third. Sargent was sedated. His left foreleg was shaved from the knee down, and Driscoll had a portable imaging unit positioned at the joint, the screen showing the grayscale landscape of bone and soft tissue that Emily hadn't looked at in 3 years but knew how to read. She looked at it before she looked at anything else. "Osteomyelitis," Driscoll said without looking up. "Bone infection. Proximal tibia, probably started as a soft tissue injury that wasn't properly cleaned. Could be from the deployment, could be from afterward. The joint capsule is thickened." He pointed at the screen. "Here, and here. There's some periosteal reaction along this border that suggests chronic process. Months minimum, possibly over a year." "He's been compensating that long?" "The muscle mass on the affected limb is visibly reduced compared to the right. That doesn't happen in weeks." Driscoll straightened. His voice was controlled, and Emily understood the control for what it was. Anger, working itself out through precision. His last recorded physical examination by the Colvin Group was September. The wellness documentation says, "Coat healthy, gait normal, no abnormalities noted." "Normal gait," Emily said. "Normal gait." She looked at Sargent, the rise and fall of his sedated chest, the gray around his muzzle she hadn't noticed in the adrenaline of the morning. He was older than she'd thought. Or maybe he'd just been carrying this long enough that it showed. Webb was standing at the far end of the room, by a cabinet, giving Driscoll space to work. He'd been there when she came in, and hadn't said anything yet. He said something now. "September's examination," he said. "Who signed off?" Driscoll picked up a folder from the counter. "Staff signature. A man named Pryor, Thomas Pryor. He's the lead handler, the one who filed the euthanasia recommendation this morning." The room was quiet except for the soft monitoring equipment, the small sounds of the dog breathing. Pryor documented a healthy animal in September, Webb said, and recommended euthanasia for behavioral grounds in November. Yes. And in between those two events, this dog was in chronic pain severe enough to alter his muscle mass. Driscoll said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the imaging screen wasn't already saying. I need the September documentation, Emily said. The actual form, not the summary. Driscoll handed her the folder. She opened it, read, turned a page, stopped. The examination form was thorough in its formatting. A full-body checklist, systems by systems, the kind of document designed to make incomplete work look complete because the structure did the appearance of rigor, whether the content deserved it or not. She read the left foreleg entry twice, turned to the second page, found what she was looking for in the additional notes section, in small, matter-of-fact handwriting. Mild stiffness noted left hindquarter, attributed to age-appropriate joint change. No intervention indicated. Hindquarter, she said. Webb crossed the room. She held out the form. He read it. He documented the wrong leg, he said. He documented stiffness in the wrong limb and attributed it to aging and moved on. Emily closed the folder. Either he didn't look carefully, or he looked and wrote down the wrong thing, or he looked at a different dog and filed the form against Sargent's record. She put the folder on the counter. Any of those three is a serious documentation failure. Two of them are something worse. Webb took the folder. Hollenbeck needs this tonight. He stepped out of the room with his phone already up. Emily pulled a stool to Sargent's side and sat with her forearms on the table beside him, close enough to monitor his breathing without touching him. Driscoll was drawing up medication, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, the beginning of a protocol that should have started a year ago. He's going to need surgery, Driscoll said. Debridement of the infected tissue, probably irrigation of the joint. It's doable. Prognosis for full function is, he paused, being honest, guarded. At his age, with the chronic process this established, we're looking at managing it rather than curing it. But he lives. He lives. He's not going to run canine operations again. But he lives. She looked at the dog's face, the long jaw, the graying muzzle, the slow tick of his eyelids under the sedation. He had come back from a field in Mali and spent 6 years being processed by institutions that didn't understand what he'd become in that field. And he had developed an infection nobody caught, and he had been in pain for a year or more while being documented as behaviorally deteriorating, and he had been 12 seconds from a lethal injection on a hospital lawn before a woman in split sneakers said the wrong person was reading him. He lives, she thought. That's enough for tonight. That's enough. She pulled her phone out and looked at the message again. We need to talk. And then the name. She typed back one word. When? The reply came in under a minute. Now. I'm outside the base. South Gate. She told Reyes where she was going. Reyes looked at her with the expression of someone who wanted to ask a question and had enough situational awareness to hold it. Tell Webb when he comes back in, Emily said. Don't go around him. Tell him directly. Understood. The South Gate was a secondary entrance, less staffed in the evening, a guard booth and a service road and a parking area beyond the perimeter fence. Emily walked it in 4 minutes, her breath visible in the November air, the base sounds, vehicle movement, distant voices, the ordinary operations of a military installation at night, diminishing behind her. There was a car parked at the edge of the lot outside the fence. A man was leaning against it. He was thinner than she remembered, and the thinness had the particular quality of someone who had been through something the body hadn't fully recovered from. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a jacket, and his left hand was in his jacket pocket in a way that suggested the hand didn't come out of pockets easily anymore. He was watching her walk toward him with an expression she couldn't fully read at distance, something between relief and something harder. Dario Mendez was alive. She stopped 6 feet from him. He said, I know, before she could say anything. I know what you were told. She needed a moment. She took it. Who told me was a problem, she said. Hatch told you. Hatch's report said I was KIA in the final extraction phase. He met her eyes. He looked tired in a fundamental way, not sleep tired, but the fatigue of something that had taken a long time. I wasn't, I was medically separated 8 months after. Osteomyelitis. He stopped, registered her expression. I know. I didn't find out about Sargent until last month. You've been alive for 6 years, she said. Emily, you've been alive for 6 years, and Hatch told me you were dead, and I believed it, and I left the service because I believed I had not gotten to you in time. Her voice was level. She had deployed the same mechanism she'd used in the conference room. Precision as a container for something that needed a container. I need you to tell me what happened. He told her. It took 15 minutes standing in the parking lot in the cold, and it wasn't clean. His account had gaps where the medication had been heaviest and places where the memory was unreliable, and one section where his voice went rough in a way he didn't try to smooth over. What it amounted to was this. He had been evacuated by a different team in the final extraction phase. A secondary unit she hadn't known was operating on the same site. He'd been unconscious. By the time he was stable enough to communicate, Hatch's incident report had already been filed, and the report placed Mendez's body at a location that the secondary team's route had not passed through. And the record showed what the record showed, and Mendez was a staff sergeant, and Hatch was a lieutenant colonel, and the machinery of the institutional narrative had already moved. I tried to correct it, Mendez said. I filed a statement. My medical file shows a separation date in 2020, which is not consistent with a KYA report from 2019, but he made a short, frustrated gesture with his right hand. The records are in 2 different systems. Nobody connected them, or nobody who connected them had the authority to do anything about it. Hatch, by that point, had made sure the original report was armored. He suppressed multiple incident reports, Emily said. It's in the IG investigation, including mine. Mendez looked at her. The investigation is open? Since today. Because I was on a hospital lawn this morning, and Sargent almost got put down. She watched his face process that, the dog's name landing with visible weight. He's alive. He's in the vet facility right now, on antibiotics. He has a bone infection that's been untreated for at least a year. Mendez put his back against the car. The movement was not dramatic, but it had the quality of something structural briefly giving way. The Colvin Group, he said. You know about them. I know Pryor, Thomas Pryor. His jaw tightened. He was in the Mali rotation, not on my team, adjacent unit. He knew Sargent. He knew the conditioning protocols. He stopped. He filed a euthanasia recommendation. This morning, Mendez was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone to a different register, quieter, more deliberate. Pryor was in Hatch's operational network, not formally, but he owed Hatch favors, the kind that get paid in form signing and looking away. When Hatch's command structure started getting reviewed, Pryor left the service and landed at Colvin Group. He looked at Emily. I don't know if it's connected. I came here because of the dog. I saw the news item, Cedar Falls, a combat K-9 event, a nurse who recalled Sargent with Tier 2 commands. He stopped. Nobody else knew those commands who wasn't in our unit. She thought about what he'd just given her. Not clean, not proved, not the kind of connection that held up in a formal proceeding without corroboration. But the shape of it, Hatch, Pryor, the suppressed reports, Sargent's documentation, the missing injury report, had the coherence of a thing that had been constructed. I need you to come inside, she said. I'm a civilian. I know. I need you to come inside and tell Webb what you just told me. He looked at her for a moment. In his face, she could see the 6 years, the separation, the failed statement, the specific weight of someone who had tried to correct a record and been absorbed by the bureaucratic mass of the thing they were trying to correct. She could also see underneath that something that had not been fully extinguished. Okay, he said. Webb's face, when Emily walked in with Mendez behind her, went through 3 things in 2 seconds. Recognition. He'd seen the service file photos. Calculation. And then, underneath both, something that might have been relief or might have been the particular emotion of a man who was very tired of institutions failing people and had just watched one, unexpectedly, attempt to correct itself. Staff Sergeant Mendez, he said. Mr. Mendez said, I've been out for 4 years. Mr. Mendez, Webb extended his hand. I have some questions for you. I assumed. They moved to a side room, A small office, a table, 4 chairs, the kind of functional space that existed for exactly this kind of conversation. Hollenbeck was summoned and arrived in 8 minutes with her tablet and the same composed efficiency as before, though this time Emily caught something in her expression when she saw Mendez that wasn't entirely professional composure. Something human. The specific look of someone who had seen the gap in a document and was now looking at what had been in the gap. Mendez laid it out. He was precise in the way of someone who had rehearsed this. Not a script, but the precision of someone who'd gone over the facts so many times they'd worn grooves and now came out cleanly. Hollenbeck recorded. Webb listened with his hands flat on the table. Emily sat to Mendez's left and said nothing because there was nothing to add. When Mendez reached the part about Pryor, Hollenbeck paused the recording. You're alleging a direct personal connection between Pryor and the former Lieutenant Colonel Hatch. I'm not alleging, Mendez said. I'm telling you what I observed during the Mali rotation. What it constitutes legally is your department. Hollenbeck looked at Webb. Webb looked at Emily. Colvin Group, Emily said. The contract review. If Pryor's connection to Hatch's network can be established, it changes the character of the documentation failures. They're not just negligence. Their pattern, Hollenbeck said. Yes. The recording resumed. Mendez finished. The room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms were quiet when people were processing a significant shift. Mr. Mendez, Webb said, how long have you been in Cedar Falls? I arrived this afternoon. I drove from Kansas City when I saw the news item. You have a place to stay. I'll find one. Webb looked at Hollenbeck. A decision made and communicated without words. You'll stay on base tonight, guest quarters. Tomorrow morning, you'll give a formal statement to Hollenbeck's team. That's Mendez started. Not optional, Webb said. Not unkindly. I have 6 years of paperwork to unfold, and you're the primary documentary corrective. You'll stay on base. Mendez nodded. He looked tired enough that argument would have been beyond him anyway. Emily walked out of the office and stood in the corridor for a moment. The vet facility was at the other end of the building, and she could hear the faint electronic tone of monitoring equipment from here. She thought about Sargent in there, sedated, being given medication that was going to start, slowly, to address something that had been hurting him for months. She thought about the form with the wrong leg documented. She thought about Thomas Pryor signing it. Her phone buzzed. Sandra Briggs. She answered. Emily. Sandra's voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not the careful managing tone of a charge nurse. Not the discomfort of the Voss meeting, shaken. I need to tell you something. I should have told you earlier, and I didn't, and I need to tell you now. Okay? When Voss called you on the lawn this morning, to his office. A pause. He'd already called the board, before he called you. He called 2 board members and described what had happened as a staff liability incident. He used those words. Liability incident. Sandra, he's been on the phone with them on and off all evening. I overheard, not intentionally, but the walls in this building aren't what they should be, and his voice carries. She stopped. He's trying to frame today as an unauthorized employee action with potential insurance implications. He's trying to get out in front of it before the military review makes it a story. Emily leaned against the wall. Does he know about the investigation? The IG review of Hatch? The contract review on Colvin Group? I don't know what he knows, but he made another call about an hour ago that I caught part of. Sandra's voice was very controlled now. He called someone in the state health department. I heard him say your name and the phrase nursing license review. The corridor was quiet. Down at the end of it, Sargent's monitoring equipment beeped softly. He's going after your license, Sandra said. I don't know if he can make it stick. I don't know what grounds he's claiming, but he's moving on it tonight before anything else gets established. Emily closed her eyes for 1 second. 1. Then, thank you, Sandra. I should have said something earlier. When he asked me to come to that meeting this afternoon, I knew what it was. I told myself it was just HR process. It was just HR process, Emily said. Until it wasn't. She ended the call and went back to the office. Webb and Hollenbeck were still at the table, Mendez with them, the recording still running. "We have a new issue," she said. She laid out what Sandra had told her. Webb's expression didn't change much, but his attention sharpened in a way she'd learned to read. Hollenbeck stopped writing and looked up. A nursing license review initiated by a hospital administrator in response to a staff member's cooperation with a federal investigation, Hollenbeck said, very carefully, would be an extraordinary overreach, potentially illegal. "If that's what it is," Emily said. "If," Hollenbeck agreed. "We'd need to establish the timeline. If Voss initiated contact with the state health board after he knew about the federal review, he knew about Webb's meeting this afternoon," Emily said. "Colvin told me Voss called him about managing the situation. That call happened before my meeting with Webb's team, which means Voss understood what was in motion before he made his calls to the board and the health department." Hollenbeck looked at Webb. "Get me his call log," Webb said. "Tonight. I can request tonight, Tricia." Hollenbeck reached for her phone. It took the rest of the evening. Emily stayed at the base because there was nowhere better to be, and because leaving felt like ceding ground she hadn't finished with yet. She drank bad coffee from a machine in the corridor and checked on Sargent twice. He was stable, the infection markers already responding to the antibiotics. Driscoll's quiet satisfaction at the vital signs the only warmth in the building's clinical atmosphere. At 10:30, Hollenbeck came out of the office and found Emily in the corridor. "Voss made 3 calls to the state health board over 4 hours," she said, without preamble. "The first was at 2:15 this afternoon, 40 minutes before your meeting with Colonel Webb. The second was at 5:40. The third was at 9 this evening." She looked at her notes. "The basis of complaint he filed is unauthorized medical intervention in an emergency situation. Specifically, he's claiming you engaged with the K-9 in a capacity that constituted medical decision-making beyond your nursing scope of practice." Emily was quiet for a moment. "A dog," she said. "He's claiming nursing scope of practice applies to a military working dog." "It won't hold," Hollenbeck said. "It's not a coherent legal theory, but the filing itself causes problems. A complaint triggers an automatic review period, which means your license is technically under examination while the review proceeds, which could be used to question your standing as a witness or a participant in any related proceedings. He's trying to muddy the water. He's trying to create a procedural delay that makes it harder to use your testimony cleanly." Hollenbeck put her notes away. "The problem is the timing of the first call, 2:15. That's before you went to his office. That's before your meeting with us. That call was made while you were still on the lawn." Emily thought about the banner. Raven Ridge Cares stretched between its 2 light poles while, in the 4th-floor office above it, a man was already calling the state health board before the grass stains on her scrubs were dry. "He didn't wait to see what this was," she said. "He didn't wait to assess whether I'd done something wrong. He started filing before he even spoke to me." "Which suggests," Hollenbeck said, "that the concern was never about what you'd done wrong. It was about what you might know." The corridor. The monitoring equipment at the end of it. The small sounds of an animal healing. "Colvin called him," Emily said, "after the incident, before Colvin called me. That was the first call, like, not Voss to Colvin, Colvin to Voss." She worked it through. Colvin saw what happened on the lawn and understood what it meant for his contract, and he called Voss because they had an existing relationship, because Voss had a stake in the Colvin Group contract, and Voss's first response was to start building a record against me. Hollenbeck said nothing. "Is Voss connected to the contract financially?" Emily said. "Not formally, but the board members he called, do any of them have a relationship with Colvin Group?" "That," Hollenbeck said, "is tomorrow's conversation." But her expression, tightly controlled as it was, carried the answer already. The morning arrived gray and cold, Cedar Falls in November asserting itself through the windows of the base's guest block where Emily had slept 4 hours on a narrow bed with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to extract rest from whatever was available. She washed her face, put on the same clothes, and went back to the vet facility. Sargent was awake, groggy, still medicated, but his eyes were tracking, and when she came through the door, his head lifted. He couldn't do much more than that. The foreleg was dressed and elevated, Driscoll's neat work from the previous night, but the lift of his head had something in it she recognized. "Good morning," she said. He watched her settle into the chair beside the table. "You're going to be annoyed about the restricted movement," she told him. "You're going to want to get up, and you won't be able to, and you're going to take it out on whoever's nearest." She folded her arms on the table's edge. "That's fine. Take it out on me." Sargent put his chin on his forepaws and watched her with the concentrated, slightly accusing gaze of an animal that had opinions about its situation. Webb arrived at 8 with Hollenbeck and a civilian Emily hadn't met, a woman from the IG's office who had driven up from the regional field office overnight, which told Emily more about how the investigation had scaled than any briefing would have. Her name was Special Agent Renata Vega, and she shook Emily's hand with the grip of someone who'd driven 4 hours on 2 hours of sleep and wasn't going to let that affect her professionalism. "I want to walk you through what we have," Vega said. They gathered in the office, Emily, Webb, Hollenbeck, Vega, and Mendez, who appeared looking like he'd slept marginally better than Emily and had found a clean shirt somewhere. As of this morning, the formal IG review of Gerald Hatch's conduct has been expanded to include his associated network, which now encompasses, provisionally, Thomas Pryor and potentially Harlan Voss. "Provisionally," Emily said. "We don't move fast in this office," Vega said. "We move correctly. Right now, Voss is a person of interest based on the call timing and his relationship with Colvin. That's different from a target. I need you to understand that distinction." "I understand it." The Colvin Group contract is suspended effective this morning. Briar Station's contracting officer signed off at 7 a.m. Pryor and the 2 other Colvin handlers have been formally excluded from base access pending the review. Vega looked at her notes. The 7 euthanasia cases from the last 4 years are being pulled. Each will be reviewed by an independent behavioral veterinarian. 7 dogs. "Some of those animals," Emily said. "Were they like Sargent? Was there a physical component that was missed?" Vega looked at her. 2 of the 7 have physical records that are inconsistent with the behavioral assessments. Whether that means what you're suggesting, I can't say yet. She absorbed that. Not cleanly. There was no clean way to absorb it. Mendez, beside her, said nothing. He had the stillness of someone who had known about Pryor for longer than this and had been carrying it in the way you carried things when no one was listening. "The nursing license complaint," Emily said. "What happens to it?" "The filing stands for now. I can't intervene in a state board process," Vega said. "But we're documenting the timeline and the apparent motive, and we're notifying the board's legal office of the federal context. They won't move quickly on a complaint that's entangled with an active IG investigation." She looked directly at Emily. "Your license is not in danger. What Voss filed is not going to hold up. But it's going to sit in a pending status for longer than it should, and I'm sorry about that." "Okay," Emily said. She had known worse delays. She had known longer waits for things that were rightfully hers. "What do you need from me today?" "Your formal statement, all of it. The lawn, the meeting with Voss, Harlow's, everything Mendez told you at the South Gate." Vega opened a case folder. "We're going to need it detailed, and we're going to need it today because," she paused, looked at Webb. Something passing between them. "Tell her," Webb said. "Voss called an emergency board meeting," Vega said. "This morning at 10. We believe he's going to present a version of yesterday's events to the hospital board that preempts the investigation's findings and positions him as a proactive manager who identified and addressed a liability exposure." Emily looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:22. "The meeting is at 10, she said. "Yes." "And you can't stop it." "Not directly. The hospital board is a private governance body. We have no legal authority to interrupt their proceedings." Vega's voice was steady and factual. "What we can do is ensure that by the time that meeting concludes, the board has received, through proper channels, the documentation of Voss's call timeline and his relationship with Colvin Group." "Through proper channels," Emily repeated. "How long does that take?" Vega looked at her. "He has 90 minutes to set a narrative," Emily said, "if the board accepts it before your documentation arrives." "I know," Vega said. The room was quiet. Sargent's monitoring equipment beeped at the end of the hall. Outside the window, Cedar Falls was waking up to a gray Tuesday morning, a city going about its business while Inside two different buildings on opposite ends of town, two separate versions of what had happened on a hospital lawn yesterday were being assembled and aimed at the same audience. Emily stood up. "There's someone on that board," she said, "who doesn't know what Voss has done. There's someone on that board who signed up to govern a hospital and has no idea that the administrator they hired is currently trying to protect a contract arrangement that resulted in 7 military animals being killed." She looked at Webb. "You have authority to contact Briar Station's liaison to the hospital board. The base has a formal relationship with Raven Ridge through the Veteran Outreach Program." Webb looked at her. "I have authority to inform the liaison of the contract suspension, officially, as a matter of base hospital operational protocol. If that information reached the board before 10 o'clock, that would be a matter of communication timing," Webb said, "over which I have no control." He picked up his phone and walked out of the room. Vega watched him go. Then she looked at Emily with the expression of someone revising a previous assessment. "Your statement," Vega said. "Start from the beginning." Emily sat back down. Outside, a Cedar Falls morning continued in its gray and unremarkable way, and somewhere across the city, Harlan Voss was putting on his best blazer again. She started talking. It came out differently than she expected. She had thought it would be procedural, plus dates, times, observations, the clean architecture of a formal account. And it was those things. But it was also the grass under her knees, and the weight of the dog against her leg, and the specific feeling of a word she hadn't said in 6 years coming out of her mouth and meaning something. It was Sandra Briggs's voice on the phone, shaken through her professional composure. It was Mendez at the south gate, thinner, alive. It was Driscoll's face over the imaging screen, doing his arithmetic of shame and professional responsibility. It was all of it. She told all of it. At 9:47, Webb came back through the door. His phone was in his hand and his face was doing the arithmetic thing. "The board's liaison," he said, "has asked that the 10 o'clock meeting be postponed pending receipts of documentation from the base." Emily looked at him. "Voss," Webb said, "has been informed." The way he said it, what Voss had said in response to being informed, what Voss's face had done, what the morning had just become for a man who had spent yesterday building walls, was not in those 3 words, but it was implied by all of them. Vega closed her case folder. She looked at Emily across the table with the careful, assessing look of someone who had come to Cedar Falls expecting a witness and was recalibrating towards something else. "Miss Carter," she said, "after we're done today, what do you want?" Emily thought about Sargent's head lifting when she came through the door. She thought about Mendez at the south gate. "We need to talk." 6 years compressed into 4 words. She thought about 7 dogs, and 2 with inconsistent physical records, and whatever those records were going to show when someone who knew what they were looking for went through them. She thought about what she actually wanted. She hadn't let herself want anything in 6 years. Wanting required a future you believed in, and she had been living in a present that repeated itself. Night shift to night shift, the studio apartment, and the cactus and the bus routes. "I want Sargent's surgery to go well," she said. "I want Mendez's statement in the formal record where it belongs. I want the board to see Voss's call log before they see anything he prepared." She paused. "After that," her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was Washington, D.C. She looked at it, then at Vega, then at Webb. "Are you expecting a call?" Vega said. "No," Emily said. She answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's, brisk and certain. The voice of someone who made calls like this from an office with a good view and expected the person on the other end to understand immediately why she was calling. "Ms. Carter, this is Deputy Director Ann Marsh, Department of Defense Working Dog Program, Office of the Secretary." A pause of exactly the right length. "I've been briefed on the events at Cedar Falls. I'm calling because we have a significant problem, and I'm told you may be the only person currently positioned to address it." Emily didn't say anything. She waited. "The Colvin Group," Marsh said, "holds contracts not just with Briar Station. They hold contracts with 4 other installations. Combined, they have had custody of or assessment authority over 31 military working dogs in the last 4 years. Another pause. We've just pulled the aggregate euthanasia data. Emily felt the number coming before Marsh said it. 19, Marsh said. 19 animals. The room had gone very still. Webb was watching her. Vega had opened her folder again. Ms. Carter, Marsh said, I need to know what you know, and I need to know it now. Everything, Emily said. Give me an hour. She didn't ask Marsh to hold. She asked for a callback number, wrote it on the inside cover of Vega's case folder because it was the nearest paper, and ended the call. Webb was already standing. How many installations? 4 others. 31 dogs total, 19 dead. She handed the folder back to Vega. The Colvin Group's Briar Station contract wasn't the main operation. It was one branch. The room did the thing rooms did when the scope of something expanded past what people had been preparing for. A collective recalibration, the specific stillness of people doing math they hadn't expected to do. Vega was on her phone before Emily finished the sentence. Hollenbeck was pulling up something on her tablet. Mendez, at the end of the table, had gone very still in the way of someone who had been carrying a piece of a picture for a long time and was now seeing the frame it belonged to. Pryor wasn't just a problem handler, he said. Not a question. He was a distribution point, Emily said. He came with credentials, and those credentials opened doors at multiple installations. Colvin built a national contract on the credibility of the people he acquired. She was thinking out loud, working through it the way she'd worked through Sargent's behavior on the lawn. Not guessing, reading. The methodology was the same everywhere. That's how you get consistent outcomes across different locations, different animals, different handlers. The same wrong framework, applied uniformly. 19 animals, Mendez said. Quietly, like a number that needed to be said aloud to become real. We don't know yet how many of those 19 had a physical component that was missed, Emily said. We don't know how many were genuinely behavioral versus misread pain response versus... She stopped. We'll know. When the records come in, we'll know. She called Marsh back. The next hour was one of the stranger hours of Emily's professional life, and she had a reference pool that included a field extraction in West Africa and 3 years of night shift MSurg. She sat at the table in the base office with Webb and Vega on either side of her, Hollenbeck across from her coordinating with Marsh's office, and she went through everything she knew about combat-conditioned working dog behavior, the Tier 2 protocols, the specific indicators that distinguished conditioned response from aggression, the physical symptoms that mimicked behavioral deterioration, the documentation failures she'd identified in Sargent's record, and what they suggested about systemic practice at the Colvin Group. Marsh listened with the attention of someone who understood that she was listening to the difference between what she'd been told and what was true. When Emily finished, Marsh was quiet for a moment. We have 3 animals at Colvin Group facilities right now who are flagged for behavioral euthanasia, she said. Scheduled reviews in the next 2 weeks. Pull them, Emily said. All 3. Today. Independent veterinary assessment, physical workup first before anyone looks at behavioral records. On whose authority? Yours, Emily said. You're the deputy director. Pull them. Another pause. I'll need a written recommendation from a credentialed specialist to move that fast through the process. I'll write it. Emily looked at Webb. He nodded once. Get me the documentation on all 3 animals and I'll have a written assessment to you by end of business. She had not practiced veterinary medicine. She had not held a clinical credential in animal care for 6 years. What she had was a specialized operational knowledge of military working dog conditioning that exactly 0 credentialed civilian veterinarians in the country possessed at the depth she possessed it. And Marsh's office knew that, which was why the deputy director of a federal program was on the phone with a floor nurse from Cedar Falls. The world was imprecise in ways that institutional credentials didn't always capture. Sometimes the person who knew the most wasn't the person with the right paperwork. Emily had spent 6 years being managed by that gap, and she was done letting it manage her. The Raven Ridge board meeting happened at 1 o'clock instead of 10, delayed 3 hours by the documentation Webb's liaison had delivered. Emily wasn't in the room. She didn't need to be. She learned what happened inside it from Sandra, who had been asked to attend as a clinical witness, and who called Emily at 2:45 with the careful, measured voice of someone reporting something she'd been composing in her head since it ended. Voss had presented his version for 11 minutes before the board chair. a retired federal judge named Patricia Osei, who had been on the Raven Ridge board for 7 years and had not, in Sandra's assessment, survived that long by missing things, stopped him and asked him to explain the call log. He tried. The explanation required him to admit he'd called Colvin before speaking to Emily, which required him to admit he knew Colvin personally, which required him to explain the nature of that relationship, which he described as a professional acquaintance. Osei asked him to define professional acquaintance. He elaborated. She asked about the board members he'd called the previous evening. He described those calls as routine stakeholder communication. She asked him why routine stakeholder communication had preceded any internal investigation of the incident. He didn't have a good answer for that. He had a practiced answer, which was a different thing, and Osei knew the difference. By 3 o'clock, the board had voted to place Voss on administrative leave pending an independent review of his conduct and his relationship with the Colvin Group. The vote was 6-1. The one dissenting board member, Sandra told her, was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had, in the previous tax year, received a charitable donation to his family foundation from a Colvin Group subsidiary. Fitch voted no, Emily said, and then immediately recused himself when someone mentioned the subsidiary, Sandra said. So it was functionally 6-0. A pause. Osei asked me about you, about your work on the unit. I told her the truth, that you were competent, that you were self-contained, and that I had used the word odd in a performance review and that I was wrong to use it. Emily said nothing. She wants to speak with you, Sandra said. When you have time. Tell her I'll call tomorrow. What? Sergeant's surgery was the following morning. It was not dramatic. It was a 2-hour orthopedic procedure on an aging German shepherd that required careful debridement of infected bone tissue, irrigation of the joint, and placement of a drain that would need management for several days. Driscoll performed it with the focused competence of someone who had made a decision about who he intended to be professionally and was demonstrating it through the quality of his work. Emily waited outside. Not because she needed to, she wasn't family, she had no formal standing, but because it felt wrong to be anywhere else. Reyes waited with her. They didn't talk much. Reyes drank coffee from a paper cup, and Emily drank water, and they sat in 2 chairs in the corridor outside the surgical suite and let the time pass. The way time passed when the outcome was out of your hands. When Driscoll came out, he said, "He's stable," and Emily felt something release in her chest that had been contracted since she'd sat down in those chairs. "Full recovery?" she said. "Functional recovery," Driscoll said, being honest the same way he'd been honest the night before. "He won't do field work again. He'll have some joint stiffness long term, especially in the cold, but he'll walk, he'll run short distances, he'll have quality of life." He paused. "He's going to need a permanent placement, a home. He can't go back into a working kennel environment." Emily looked at him. "I'm not in a position to arrange that," Driscoll said, carefully. "But I thought you should know." How about? The formal statement process took 3 days. Not 3 hours, not one long session. 3 days of documentation, review, supplementary questions, records pulled and cross-referenced, the slow machinery of institutional accountability doing the thing it rarely did well, but was, in this case, doing. Vega ran it with the same methodical patience she'd shown from the beginning. Mendez's statement went in on the 2nd day, a formal deposition that corrected the 6-year-old KIA record and placed his name in the living column of the document where it had always belonged. The correction of the record was not ceremonial. There was no moment where someone handed Mendez a piece of paper and said, "This makes it right." The record was updated in a database. A notation was added to Hatch's IG file. A separate process was initiated to review Mendez's separation documentation and the benefits he had or hadn't received in the years when the military understood him to be dead. It was administrative and incomplete and going to take longer than it should, and Mendez knew that, and he sat with the knowledge the way he sat with most things, with the practiced endurance of someone who had already waited longer than was fair. On the 3rd day, Vega came to Emily with a summary document and set it on the table. "For your review before it goes formal," she said. Emily read it. It took a while. The formal findings documented: the suppression of Emily's 2019 incident report by then Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Hatch, The inaccuracy of the KYA classification of Staff Sergeant Dario Mendez, the pattern of inadequate documentation and negligent physical assessment by Colvin Group personnel across 5 military installations, the direct financial relationship between Douglas Colvin and 2 members of the Raven Ridge Hospital Board, including Gerald Fitch, and the retaliatory nature of Harlan Voss's nursing license complaint filed prior to any internal investigation and in direct coordination with a party under federal review. The findings on Emily herself occupied 2 paragraphs near the end. They were precise and, for the first time in 6 years, accurate. Her field conduct in the March 2019 Molly extraction was reviewed independently and found to be within protocol. The decisions she had made under fire, the deviations from the stated plan that Hatch had characterized as the cause of the tragedy, were assessed by 3 independent reviewers as tactically sound and consistent with field medical judgment under combat conditions. The loss of personnel in that extraction was attributed to a command-level protocol failure in Hatch's operational structure, not to the actions of the attached medical personnel. She was, formally and on the record, cleared. She read those 2 paragraphs twice, not because she needed to read them twice to understand them, because she had been waiting 6 years for them to exist, and they existed now, and she wanted to be sure she was actually reading them and not constructing them from a long-held need. "Okay," she said. Vega looked at her. "That's all you've got?" Emily thought about it. "Yeah," she said, that's all I've got." It wasn't that the clearance didn't matter. It mattered in ways she'd been aware of, sitting at the edge of her narrow bed in the studio apartment with the cactus and the split sneakers and the weight of what she'd been told she'd done wrong. It mattered completely. But the weight hadn't been a single stone she could set down now. It had been distributed through everything, through 3 years of night shifts and deliberate unremarkability and not letting herself want things, and it was going to take longer than a paragraph to redistribute. She knew that. She was okay with knowing it. "What happens to Hatch?" she said. "Court-martial proceedings are initiated as of this morning," Vega said. "He's been notified. The suppressed reports, but not just yours, there are 4 others, constitute a pattern of conduct that the IG's office is treating as a criminal matter, not just an administrative one." She paused. "That process will take time. It will be contested. He has lawyers." "I know. But it's in motion, publicly. His name and the findings will be in the formal record before the week is out." And Colvin. Federal contract fraud charges are being prepared. The aggregate findings across 5 installations give the DOJ enough to work with. Vega's voice was neutral and precise. Colvin's lawyers have already made preliminary contact with the prosecutor's office. He's looking for a deal. "The 3 animals they pulled," Emily said. "The ones flagged for behavioral euthanasia. All 3 have been assessed. 2 have physical conditions. One a spinal compression that was generating what the Colvin handlers documented as unpredictable aggression, one a chronic ear infection causing hypersensitivity that was misread as handler-directed threat behavior." Vega's expression didn't change, but something in her voice did, slightly. "Both are being treated. Both are expected to make recoveries." "And the 3rd?" "The 3rd has a genuine behavioral trauma profile that needs specialized rehabilitation." Vega looked at her directly. "That's a longer conversation, one that's been requested by Deputy Director Marsh." The call with Marsh happened the following afternoon, and it was direct in the way of someone who had been running a federal program long enough to stop performing authority and simply exercise it. "We need to redesign the rehabilitation assessment protocol," Marsh said, "for all working dogs, but starting with combat-conditioned animals. What we've been doing has an obvious gap. The evaluation criteria were developed without input from anyone with field deployment experience with these specific animals, and the Colvin Group situation is the predictable outcome of that gap." A pause. "I want to establish a specialist advisory panel. Credentialed veterinarians plus people with direct operational knowledge. I want you on it." "As a nurse," Emily said, "as the person who identified a misread behavioral assessment from 30 feet away and recalled a combat-conditioned dog using a protocol that's been dormant for 6 years," Marsh said flatly. "Your formal credentials are a separate conversation. The knowledge you have is not. Emily was quiet for a moment. I have conditions. I expected that. The panel has to include working dog handlers, active and former, not just veterinary and administrative staff. Done. Mendez, she said, he has operational knowledge and he has standing in this situation. He should be part of the review of the Mali mission documentation and any related protocol revision. I'll make the call. And Sergeant, Emily said, he needs a permanent placement, a home with access to specialized veterinary follow-up. That placement needs to be formal and funded, not left to whoever happens to be nearby. Marsh was quiet for a beat. The program has a process for retired working dog placement. The process takes months and the outcome is inconsistent, Emily said. I'd like to propose a specific placement with a formal follow-up arrangement attached. Propose it, Marsh said. Emily looked through the window of the base office at the Cedar Falls sky, gray turning pale at the edges as the morning moved toward noon. She had a studio apartment with a cactus on the windowsill and a neighbor who was her only emergency contact and a bus route she knew from memory. She also had, for the first time in 6 years, a reason to rearrange some things. I'll take him, she said. 3 months later, Cedar Falls had a cold snap that kept most people indoors and turned the sidewalks into something requiring careful navigation. Emily walked them every morning with Sergeant at her left side, his gait slightly uneven in the cold, the left foreleg holding up but asking for accommodation, which she gave by keeping the pace easy and letting him set the distance. He had moved into the apartment the week after the surgery. This had required a conversation with her landlord, a security deposit, and the acquisition of a dog bed that Sergeant immediately identified as optional and continued to sleep beside rather than in. The cactus had been relocated to the top of the refrigerator where it was safer from investigation. He was better. Not perfect. The joint was going to be a permanent consideration, and cold mornings showed it, and there were nights when he startled at sounds and needed a minute to locate himself. But he was present in the way he hadn't been on that hospital lawn, fully inhabiting the space he was in rather than occupying it with one foot somewhere else. He had opinions about his food and about which side of the couch he preferred and about the specific inadequacy of the standard morning walk distance, and his opinions were inconvenient and constant, and Emily found them, in a way she hadn't anticipated, grounding. The advisory panel had its first formal meeting in January in Washington, in a conference room that overlooked a gray federal courtyard and smelled of institutional coffee. There were 9 people at the table, 3 veterinarians, 2 active duty handlers, 2 former handlers including Mendez, Marsh's deputy liaison, and Emily. The meeting lasted 6 hours and produced 40 pages of preliminary notes and a framework document that would need 3 more meetings to become an actual protocol, which was exactly how these things worked, and no faster. Mendez sat across from her at the table, and they argued professionally and specifically about 2 of the assessment criteria, and they were both right about different aspects of the disagreement, and the final language reflected both positions, which was also how these things worked when the people in the room were there to get it right rather than to win. After the meeting, they got dinner at a place near the hotel, the kind of restaurant that existed near federal buildings everywhere, and ate mediocre pasta and drank mediocre wine and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with Molly or Hatch or the investigation. He told her about Kansas City, about the job he'd had, about the leg. She told him about Cedar Falls, about the bus routes, about the cactus. They were careful around certain edges and direct about others, the specific negotiation of 2 people who shared a piece of history that was too large to address all at once and had apparently, without decided to address it incrementally. He asked about Sargent. She showed him a photo on her phone. Sargent on the couch, taking up 2/3 of it, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a dog who had strong opinions about being photographed. Mendez looked at the photo for a long moment. "He looks good," he said. "He's bossy," Emily said. "He has a lot of feelings about breakfast." "He always did," Mendez said. His voice was level, but underneath it something that had been held for 6 years was releasing. She could hear it. "He tried to steal my rations every morning for 2 years." Emily didn't say anything. She let him have the memory. "You saved him," Mendez said. She thought about that. Thought about the hospital lawn, the split sneaker, the crowd watching her kneel in the grass and not knowing what they were seeing. She thought about Sargent's head lifting when she came through the door of the vet facility, the specific quality of that recognition. She thought about what it actually meant to save something, not the dramatic version, not the version with clear lines between the moment before and the moment after, but the real version, which was incremental and imperfect and required the saved thing to do most of the work itself. He came back on his own, she said. I just gave him a reason to. Mendez looked at her. He understood what she meant because he had been something that came back on its own after a very long time, and the people who had given him reason to, the ones who'd treated him in 2019, the ones who'd eventually connected the records, Vega's office, the IG investigators, none of them had done the returning. He had. That was how it worked.
Still, he said. Still, she agreed.
In February, the first formal charges in the Hatch court-martial were made public. His name appeared in the national news cycle for approximately 4 days, long enough for the shape of it to be understood, short enough that the coverage moved on before the proceedings did, because proceedings took time and coverage didn't wait for time. Vega had warned her about this. Emily read the initial articles and then didn't follow the ongoing coverage with any particular attention, not because she didn't care about the outcome, but because the outcome was in motion and watching it move didn't change its speed. Douglas Colvin accepted a plea arrangement in March. The formal charge was federal contract fraud. The arrangement required full financial restitution to the affected installations, a lifetime bar from government contracting, and cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the documentation failures at each site. His lawyers managed to keep him out of a custodial sentence, which Vega told Emily was the expected outcome given the evidentiary landscape, and which Emily received with the specific equanimity of someone who had learned that the justice available in the world was not always the justice that felt proportionate, but was sometimes the justice that was achievable, and that those were different things worth keeping distinct. Thomas Pryor's situation was less resolved and more complicated, which was often how it went with the people in the middle, connected to the network above them, responsible for harm below them, and difficult to fully prosecute without implicating themselves in a way that required cooperation from people who weren't yet cooperating. His base access had been permanently revoked. A separate civil action was being prepared by the families of 2 veterans whose dogs had been among the 7 euthanized at Briar Station. Vega thought that action had legs. Emily hoped she was right. Harlan Voss resigned from Raven Ridge Medical Center in January before the board's independent review concluded, which meant the review concluded in the absence of his cooperation, and the findings went into the record with the particular weight of an account given entirely by everyone except the principal subject. The nursing license complaint was formally withdrawn as part of a settlement that also required him to provide written acknowledgement that the complaint had been filed without factual basis. Emily's license was cleared, had never technically been in danger, as Hollenbeck had promised, but the pending status was closed and the record was clean. Board Chair Patricia Osei called her personally to communicate this, which Emily hadn't expected. I wanted to say it directly, Osei said. What happened was a misuse of institutional process to target someone inconvenient. That's a specific kind of wrong. The fact that it didn't ultimately succeed doesn't make it less wrong. I know, Emily said. Are you coming back to the floor? Emily thought about it. Genuinely. She had the night shifts, the M-Surg rotation, the patients who needed consistent care, the work that was real and concrete and mattered in a way she hadn't let herself stop valuing during the years she'd been doing it as camouflage. She hadn't been hiding from the work, she'd been hiding in it. Those were different things. Not tonight's, she said, and I want to keep the panel work. Some months that's going to pull me. We can accommodate that, Osei said. Sandra has been asking. Emily almost smiled. Tell Sandra I'll be in Monday. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Emily stood in front of a room of 12 people at Briar Station's conference facility, 8 veterans, 4 of them currently in residential transition housing, and 4 dogs in various stages of rehabilitation. The veterans ranged from a 24-year-old who'd deployed twice and come home to nothing recognizable to a 51-year-old who'd been in the system for 3 decades and was on his second life rebuild. And the dogs ranged from a lab who was bored and needed purpose to a Belgian Malinois who was sergeant levels of complicated and needed someone who understood that complicated wasn't the same as broken. The program didn't have a name yet. It was still in its pilot phase, still figuring out its own shape. Which veterans, which dogs, what the pairing criteria should be, how to structure the time so it was useful and not performative. Emily had opinions about all of these things and shared them regularly with the two other program coordinators, one of whom agreed with her most of the time, and one of whom disagreed with her most of the time. And the argument between them was producing something better than either of them would have built alone. Sargent was in the room. He sat beside Emily at the front, his presence the unofficial credentialing that no title or document had fully managed to confer. The veterans looked at him with the recognition of people who knew what a working dog was, what it had been through, what it cost to come back from something. Emily looked at the room. 12 people, 8 of them carrying the specific weight of having been trained for a world that no longer wanted them in the same capacity. She knew something about that. She wasn't going to stand in front of them and tell them it would be easy. It wasn't. The veteran on her left had nightmares that woke his roommates. The Malinois in the back corner had bitten his last 3 handlers and was on his final probationary placement. The 24-year-old was still convinced on most days that he didn't deserve anything better than what he currently had, which wasn't much. None of this was going to resolve cleanly. None of it was going to resolve quickly. The program would have failures, placements that didn't work, dogs that couldn't be reached, veterans who left before they were ready or stayed past the point of usefulness. Emily was not the kind of person who looked at those probabilities and saw a reason to stop. She thought about what she'd said to Mendez at dinner. He came back on his own. I just gave him a reason to. She thought about what it had taken for her to come back. Not the investigation, not the cleared record, not the formal acknowledgement of what had been done wrong. Those mattered. But what had actually pulled her back was a dog's weight against her leg on a hospital lawn, the specific gravity of something that needed to be seen correctly, and the fact that she had been the person positioned to see it. You could spend years making yourself small enough not to matter, and then one morning a gate comes down in a public place, and you recognize something that nobody else in the crowd recognizes, and you either say something or you don't. She had said something. She looked at the 12 people in the room, and she thought about all the different versions of a person who has been dismissed and is deciding, in some quiet internal room, whether to say something anyway. Okay, Emily said. Let's start. Sargent lifted his head. The room leaned forward, and that, it turned out, was enough.